All right, we're getting set up here. If you're joining us today, please say hi in the chat. We look forward to talking with you. I'm here with Dr. Alexandra Mihai, and we're going to be talking about social media and teaching. So give me one sec, just getting set up, and then we'll get started. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Van Alstyne. I'm so excited that you've joined me. This is the first episode of the new season of The Social Academic on YouTube. And today, Dr. Alexandra Mihai is joining me from London, and we're going to be talking about how to teach with social media. Why is social media something that can be great for your students? How can it be used in your lesson plans? So we're going to get into it today. Alexandra, hi. Thanks for joining me. Would you mind introducing yourself just to say hi to people?
Hi, thanks a lot, Jennifer, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to discuss about this topic because actually I've been using social media much more in the past year than in the past 15, I would say, or 10 at least. So it's quite an interesting topic. I am actually joining from Berlin. So yeah, it is still on the other side of the pond for you, but it is, yeah, I've been working actually remotely. I'm a learning designer at UCL currently, but I've been working remotely from Berlin due to COVID, of course.
That's great.
And that was possible. So that I think our ways of working are also changing slowly. Yeah, I've been working at UCL for the past year, but in fact, in a few weeks, I'm starting my a new step in my career. So I will be assistant professor at the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. So yeah, there I can continue my research, but also my work on faculty development, because what I've been doing actually in the past 15 years, I've been working in 3 countries so far, but I will be adding the next one soon in Europe only, though, both in a faculty position, so teaching and doing research, but also in a faculty development or educational development role. And that is something that I grew very, very fond of, especially in the past years, and definitely in the past year, because I saw it much more relevant. I've been working with teaching and learning online since 2007. So it's been really quite a while. Obviously, everything looked and felt differently back then, including social media, whatever existed. Nevertheless, the real relevance and the real importance or usefulness of my expertise only came to the fore last year with the pandemic. And I really felt very, very happy to be able to help, at least to a certain extent, in this mad world with the transition to online teaching and, of course, online learning as well for the students. So yes, I'm looking at different ways to connect with various academics, but also to connect with various people involved in academic or educational development across the world. And social media helped me to do it.
I love that so much. And it sounds like it's something that has just become so much more relevant that people really understand why it's so important in the past year. Coronavirus has really changed how people are learning, how people are trying to develop their lessons. And so your role has become even more important and more people are aware of it. So I'm so glad that you came on the show and that we're chatting today. Now, you've been blogging for a long time. You have a newsletter/blog called The Educationalist. What do you write about and why did you get started?
So yeah, I got started about 7 or 8 years ago with my blog. And back then it was really a venue for me to talk about my research and basically my research on teaching with technology. So that was also in preparation of my PhD, and also alongside my regular research, I felt like it was really a very good exercise to blog, just to get the writing juices flowing, and it really helped, and it still helps a lot. So writing blogs and sometimes even tweets really gets me writing more. So that is actually one aspect. Maybe I'll come back later when we talk about blogs.
Yeah.
So for me, that was the role of the blog, of course, for the past years. I did it quite intermittently, so it was not very, very, it was more like my personal space, I would say.
Yeah.
But last year, I sort of, well, kind of exactly a year ago, I sort of started it more seriously again, because as I said, I felt like probably there is more need for my expertise. It turned out to be right. So I started to write much more. And soon I realized, okay, perhaps it's also good to, okay, my thoughts and my ideas were useful, I hope, for some people, but I also was in the process collecting quite a bit of other research and other voices, and resources on the topic of teaching online, mainly for the past year. And so I was doing it for myself. I was curating these resources for myself. And then I thought, okay, why not try to share that? And of course, social media, it's a good way. I mean, I've been sharing it on Twitter. My Twitter activity has been also increasing in the past year compared to the past 10 years. But it's very elusive as well. So, something is on Twitter today, tomorrow, no, well, some people might not have found it. Tomorrow is gone. I don't find it even, I have to dig in my timeline. So I thought, okay, let's make it a little bit more structured. I'm quite a structured person myself, and try to do it in a more structured and hopefully more useful way for people. And that's how my newsletter linked to the blog sort of came about. And there, of course, I continue to write my own thoughts and ideas and trying to inspire people. But I also have a big part of the newsletter, as you probably noticed, sort of curated resources. And there, I really try to do something that a lot of academics don't actually have time to do. They would love, I really believe that a lot of people would love to read more and research more on how to teach better, on how to reach their students better and so on. But there is just not enough time. And I'm not speaking only about the pandemic, it's just in general, there is not enough time. So I try to do a little bit of that work for them by collecting these resources, by reading, skimming through them if they are too long, but in any case, reading most of them and giving them my opinion as to what they could be useful for. And I've got quite a good response to that. And I do feel like it's a way to connect with the community. But I have to say here that I also use it in conjunction with my Twitter. So I think doing both is great, because actually I can do the more structured thing and the thing that people can look up later and so on in the newsletter, but I can sort of, promote it on Twitter. So for me, the mix goes. One has the sort of, immediacy, and the other one has the lasting library effect. So that's how I've been using them.
That's exactly what happened to me. I came across a tweet where you were talking about how to use Twitter in your lesson plans. And it was specifically tips that were from this article I reached out to you right away. I was like, this is the perfect topic for the social academic on YouTube, because so many people would like to include social media in their lesson plans and just really don't know how to get started. They don't know why it might be helpful for their students. So I'm excited to get into that with you. Let's see. You said that there are 3 things to keep in mind that professors should consider when thinking about social media for teaching. What was the first of those things?
Yeah, so basically, like with every tool or every method I recommend or suggest or encourage people to use, we always go into the why. Why? The idea is not to use, what is the real reasoning why you want to use a certain method. So that always links back to your learning objectives, to your teaching philosophy, to what you want your students to get out of the course ultimately, or to what skills you want them to train. There's a lot of things, but basically it has to be the why first. So, basically there has to be a clear understanding of why social media in any form can actually enhance students' learning, rather than just me using a fashionable tool that I like using perhaps, but it doesn't bring anything to the course. So it has to be really clear. But again, this goes really for all the methods and tools I'm talking about. But with social media, it's the same. So basically, why? If then the answers are multiple, and amongst them, some of them that actually, well, it really suits my course, I would love, and I can go into that a bit later. I want students to connect more broadly and so on. Yes, then we move to the next one. And the next one is how to integrate it. Because of course it's a tool, it's kind of a very tricky tool. And I want to say it from the very beginning, because obviously we're talking about a learning environment that we create for our students. And the idea is to create a learning space or learning spaces or learning paths, depending how you want to look at it. And now that we're talking about online learning paths, of course, there are various ways. And, that's actually one of the advantages of technology, that you have this flexibility. There are various ways of creating this path, of designing this path. There are various types of stories you can take your students on along, but you have to be careful. And especially most of them, and that's why I want to say most of them are confined in the learning management system. You teach within this learning management system, or VLE, whatever you call it. And that's, like a safe space. And indeed, what we need to keep in the back of our minds, regardless of the tools we are using, is to create this safe space. I'm going to come back to that, I think, because that's the main message. And it's even more important when we try to include in this mix social media, because obviously we know that students are, or some of them, I would say majority, but some of them are using at least certain forms of social media. Of course, everyone uses different things for different purposes. But whatever these purposes are, I have to say, mostly it's not learning. So we want to use it for learning. So that's the idea of using it in our courses. And therefore, the students need to have a sort of different mindset. Even though they might have been using those tools before, they need to look at them differently. And they need to look at them in the context of our course. And there we are still the masters. We create the framework in which this tool is used. I just want to emphasize this because I don't really want to advise people to just simply use social media and without other considerations, because it is an open environment. It is an environment that can get rather violent in different ways. It can go on completely different ways than what we intended. There are things we can't really control. Maybe that's also part of the objectives of using it, but there are things we can control. And we should definitely be very clear why we are using it, communicate this very clearly to students, decide on a very, so this is the how now, decide on a very narrow decide on a very clear type of activity or part of the course or strand of the course where we want to use it. And then basically make it very clear to students why this is used there. What do we want to achieve together by this? Maybe even have a discussion with them about this. Just for them to see that, regardless of how they use social media elsewhere, this is going to be used like this for these purposes. If they want to, give them a choice, if they want to create another account specifically for the course because they don't want to use their personal one, let them do it. I'm probably going to come back to that when we talk about privacy. But in any case, make sure that the framework is very clear and that the task using social media is very clearly integrated in the course. And the last point, I actually, again, in connection to the other two, but it's in a way a sub, a thing that goes kind of across. I would say try to use the social media that you are, or the social medium that you are more comfortable with. So before using something in the classroom, try, get familiar with it, even though you might just want to use something that you're not using yourself, but try to get familiar with it first. Privacy issues, how it works, what are the sort of cons, try to actually experience it by yourself. I found it that from my talks with various people and even some research, that it, for example, using Twitter really works best when the teacher is really into Twitter. Like they really get it and they get the usefulness of it, then they can really put it in practice much better in the course. That doesn't say that you cannot use it if you've never been on Twitter, but
it'll be more effective.
Be there first. So be familiar with the environment. But I guess it again goes for any method, but for social media even more, because there are lots of sides to it, facets to it.
So you could get familiar with social media in order to have a lesson for it, but it may not be the best choice. And that's especially because you need to understand why social media is going to be beneficial to your students, how they're going to do it, the exact lesson and how it fits into your course that it's going to be. And then you need to do something you're familiar with. And that's probably also important for creating that safe space that you were mentioning, that is built into the learning management systems that most professors use for their online courses. So those are are the three things to pay attention to: the why, the how, and of course, explaining these things to your students, having maybe a conversation with them, and then also using something that you might be familiar with yourself or something that you want to get familiar with in advance. That way, you'll be able to create that safe space.
Yep, exactly.
Great. One of the other things that you mentioned in your article was that there's a difference between blogging and social media. And those are kind of the two things that people tend to consider when adding in some kind of digital media element into their classroom. Can you tell me, what is the difference between blogging and social media?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Actually, I mean, you can also the definition of social media, as you know yourself, can be quite broad. So I would if we look at blogging, how it was like 10 years ago, I think it is a form of social media. I actually still think it's a form of social media. So I just made a distinction, of course, in my article, and I would still make a distinction because the ways in which we want to use those tools are different. The reasons why we might want to use them are different. Just as I was explaining in the beginning, that I use Twitter and newsletters in different for different reasons, is the same here. But the blog itself is also a form of social media because it is a bit outside the academic sphere. It is a sort of writing exercise, but it is writing for a different audience. Now, of course, again, the framework you create can be different. It can take away the social just a little bit. I wanted to mention this in the end, I think, when we talk about privacy, but again, this cuts across. So I have to mention it here as well. You can create parallel networks in a way. So mimic Twitter and mimic blogging platform inside the VLE even, but or even on a separate platform, password protected, that it's just for the classroom. If you want to create a really safe space, but sort of mimic the affordances of these tools, you can do that. Of course, that takes away part of the social part in it. I mean, it is social within your classroom, but I think what actually something that unites both. I talk more about Twitter because I don't use Facebook for this, but at all almost. And blogging is actually that it brings students, or it has the potential, if done well, to bring students a bit outside the sphere of their classroom and to teach them how to communicate their ideas to a broader audience, to a largely non-academic audience, both in written form, in a longer form or a shorter form, depending on the tool. And that's really important. And I'm going to just maybe talk a little bit about each, like Twitter first and then blogging.
Yeah,
and just
that'd
give
be
some
great.
ideas on what actually they are the best used for. And I think for Twitter, definitely it's really if you find your tribe sort of on Twitter, you can, this can be really, really useful for students as well. So it can be really useful in the first place, it can help them connect, or it can help you and them connect with experts, with people, with practitioners that work in the field you are teaching and they are learning. So it can be diplomats, it can be people working in a certain organization. I'm talking about that more because my initial field is politics. So I've been looking into cases where people used exactly those sort of organizations and people on Twitter. And that's been really, really effective and productive. So connecting with experts. Then actually the mere idea of putting them a bit outside their own bubble and exposing them to different opinions. But this is really to be done with cautious and handle with care. That's the title of my post. Actually, here the handle with care comes into place because as we see, there can be really polarized, it's kind of polarized and, bordering violent, depending on the spheres you are in. So throwing students in there, it can sound very dangerous. But it also kind of represents the world we live in. So, we protect them as long as we are in the classroom, but we can use it if done well, again, we can use it as a sort of tool to train their skills and even just making them familiar that, okay, there are other worlds out there. How do we deal with it?
Yeah.
Do we just close our eyes? That's one way. Do we ignore it? Do we respond, ad infinitum, because we can have these discussions with a different bubble forever.
Over and over again, right.
What is what is it that we would like to encourage them to do? So we can do that, but it can be an experiment. It can be to a certain extent controlled, but really it can get out of control. So here, I think we should be really careful. And I think depending, again, coming back to my initial field in politics, I could hardly recommend it these days. Just, let students lose on internet on Twitter, because that can really go very badly.
Right.
But done well, I think it can be a way to sort of, have them see that there are other opinions, because we tend to be in our own filter bubble. So we hear our friends who think the same, our family, our teacher, we all think the same. But there are other people out there, and it shouldn't come as a shock, that there are. So I think that's one way. The other thing is actually using it more, for the purpose of your course. So as a classroom communication tool. I mean, I've seen it done in this way. It doesn't necessarily have, I mean, you have other ways to do that. You have announcements, you can use the VLE for that. But if you get into the habit of doing that, this could be good. It could be good, for example, to do a sort of, that you have a hashtag, for instance, for your course.
Yeah.
And there you actually can point students to different things, to different resources that come up on Twitter. You can share them with them. And I've seen that done quite a lot. So, once you see a resource that is really interesting for your course, instead of copying it, putting it on the VLE and so on, you just, hashtag. And if of course, this is a convention that you have with your students, they will follow and check it out there. And for the rest, I think, and then of course you can continue to use it as a sort of conversation tool in the classroom, or for specific assignments, for instance. I mean, it can be as innovative as possible, in the sense that you can ask them to take a certain position, or impersonate a writer or a philosopher or whatever, up to really, as I said, very mundane business of trying to reach out to a certain organization, seeing what their social media strategy is, and stuff like that. So there can be different tasks in which you can incorporate it. And last but not least, it's something that I've been using a lot lately as a teacher, trying to connect with other teachers. And it's been, I have to say that academic Twitter is really, really quite good, quite productive, especially in the past year. It's been really useful. I connected with so many people this is an example, on so many different continents that I couldn't definitely have connected if I stayed in my bubble locally. Right. So I think I would encourage definitely people, if they are on Twitter, again, you can just be more passive and follow. But I think there is lots of interesting stuff out there, lots of interesting resources that you can get access to, instead of going to libraries or aside from the real literal research that you do. So this is Twitter. Again, it's something that is a bit more dynamic. The blogging I would use rather for different things. So the blogging is, as I said, for me, particularly space where students can practice or train their writing skills, but writing in a different way than essays that we ask, for our course assignments. So assignments using blogs really try to also train those skills that are to communicate outside your academic bubble, to try to find different ways of phrasing and framing your own research, or whatever it is that we're asking them to do. And it usually also, I mean, I found it that when used with students, they really get into it. So after a while, they really appreciate having the opportunity to also write differently. To not to only have to say the same, essay structure, research paper, and so on, to simply be a little bit more free in terms of the format they use, in terms of the media they use. They can, of course, link to lots of interesting things. And it also shows them, that's another function, I think, that can also be a way for them to curate the materials and the different media they find online. Which you can reference, but a little bit less directly in academic papers. So it really helps them also make sense of the online or the digital space, information space, which is huge these days. And I think one of the skills in general that can be trained with using social media in the classroom is making sense of this huge knowledge, information at least, floating around us, trying to, find it, process it, reference it correctly, check its validity, not least important, very, very important. So I think if we use social media, this is sort of a side skills that we train beside the content, which is our core,
Right.
but they're equally important for our students because they will be, these are skills they need every day. And it's so difficult these days to really critically think about the information we come across, especially online. So this is something that blogging and working or writing for an online environment can help us. And then, of course, you can use it again as a classroom blog where you can share resources, where you can either have, for example, students, again, depends on the task, writing their own blogs, or even in a sort of more sustained way as an e-portfolio, like a collection of posts throughout the term.
Yeah.
But you can also have a class blog where, the whole idea is to write collaboratively, to share, to comment on each other's posts, to respond to comments, you sort of, that can be a way of growing as well. And that can, even if it's cut from the outside social aspect, have a social aspect inside the classroom, at least. So,
It creates like an internal community when you're creating
exactly
the same kind of product together, which is that shared classroom blog. That sounds really cool because, you said that the social aspect was still there in blogging. And I definitely agree. There's the ability to comment on most blogs. There's the ability to actually get in touch with the person who's writing it, which makes a difference from, say, an academic article. And so when we're talking about blogging, when we're talking about social media, it is really about figuring out how to share information with an audience that is not already familiar with it. And that means that you're probably sharing different types of information or different amounts of information, certainly including details that someone already familiar might not necessarily need. And so it sounds like you can either do the long form, which is more like blogging, a classroom blog or an open blog, or there's more short form like Twitter, but that both of those can practice some of the same similar skills. That's very cool.
Yeah, indeed. I think a mix is good, but again, it has to be, I think the choice, that's another question actually, how do we choose what is appropriate, what sort of, from the various social media, what actually works for our course. And as I said, we have to go back to the initial question, the why. If what you want to do is actually have them practice their writing skills, then maybe a blog is better. Or if you want also a reflective element, then again, a blog or e-portfolio, but can be done in a blog form, is also a more apt tool. But if you want them to engage more with practitioners, for instance, or if you want them to be exposed to a certain bubble, then maybe Twitter is better. Or even if you want them to practice writing very successfly, that can be also, this is the simple act of writing a tweet, even though now it's longer, but even, in the beginning it was really hard. It's still very short. So that can be a skill in itself. So it really depends what you want to do. I personally have not used Facebook at all for professional reasons, so I cannot say about that. But actually, if we extend it a little bit, and now I'm thinking aloud, I think students, in fact, still use social media also outside our control. So, this is what I've been talking about now until now, is actually how we design it or how we can design it for learning. But we have to be aware that they usually also, because they use it anyway personally, they will also tend to use certain networks, for study groups, for instance, or if they work in a collaborative assignment, they, we might give them sort of space on the learning management system, but they might go, and have a WhatsApp group, or they might go and have a Facebook group, and they exclude us, obviously. They do it among themselves. And a lot of the times I've seen that, and in the past years, obviously I've seen it more with Facebook. I'm not sure actually these days what they use most. I think also probably WhatsApp is quite used, but I think I'm kind of ambivalent about this, because in a way I think it's okay. I mean, obviously I think it's okay, and we definitely, even if I thought it's not okay, you can hardly stop them. And it's proved to be quite effective, actually, as a complement to what we've been doing and the spaces we've been offering.
That's great.
So even Facebook groups, sometimes, if there's like study groups, and especially nowadays, I have the feeling, because the students don't have the proximity of their peers and us, the teachers, they might search for creating this sort of, or they might attempt creating those sort of spaces themselves. And of course, they would go to their go-to platforms, whatever that is, and talk to their peers. So I think that's fine, obviously, and it's also fine, and they might feel more free to explore that because we're not there. So I think that's fine. If it has good, if it mirrors well back in the course, and usually it does, from my experience, that's fine. But for instance, again, it has two sides, because for instance, if you have a group task, a collaborative task, and of course, when you are in the classroom, they can do part in the classroom, they can meet outside and so on. But nowadays, they're only online. So we might create some space on the VLE. I mean, that's fine. They can work there, or we can create a Teams, on Teams or whatever we're using these days, a space for them. Some of them might use it, but they might actually just fall back into their old patterns and try to do another group elsewhere where they feel more comfortable. And again, I'm not against that, but I think there it's really important to communicate again. To say, okay, I mean, you can do the work wherever you want, but on the platform that we are offering you, because this is what I can monitor as a teacher. This is where I can provide you feedback. And this is an important part of learning. I cannot monitor what's going on in a WhatsApp group. I cannot give feedback on what's going on in a Facebook group. You might as well be going in totally wrong direction, and there is no way I can do anything. Right. So in order for me to actually control that, it's not necessarily lack of trust, but I think it's important. It can go very badly indeed. I mean, there can be, offensive language and so on, which I cannot see. So therefore, they're also not within the university sort of rules, because they're doing it on their own. Again, maybe that's very limited, but it can happen. But I think mostly because I think any task is the process in every task is as important as the outcome, and especially in a collaborative task. So if I cannot really follow the process, of course I can ask them to report back how they worked and so on. That's a way of doing it. But if I can see the different steps, and technology helps us with that. So if I can see the different steps, it's not only that I will control or monitor or be the big brother. It can be seen like this, but it's not only this. It's I can actually provide more granular feedback. I can go to a specific point or to a specific person that I see that is lagging behind, and really personalize my support. And that I can only do when I see where they are. If I don't see, so it's really a mixed thing. I mean, their familiarity versus my sort of role as a facilitator. Yeah.
Well, I've heard about that a lot, especially this year with so many people learning remotely, that these kinds of private groups are popping up either on Facebook or WhatsApp or a number of other social media platforms. So students can communicate about the course, about things that, questions that they might have and resources that they might want to share that are related to the course. A lot of those tend to happen in spaces where the teacher isn't invited or is invited but isn't sure how they should moderate it. So I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that's actually a question people have been emailing me, and I am not always sure what to say. So I was really glad to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, I'm not really having an answer either, but I think it's something to watch out, because obviously it's not much you can do. I think it all goes back to what I said in the beginning, communicating the use of each tool and each platform very clearly to students, and also making them understand and having a dialogue, in fact, with them.
Right.
I really couldn't stress that more. Having a dialogue and saying, what, I'm not forbidding you to talk on WhatsApp. Of course, if that's the easiest for you to exchange, documents and so on, then do it. It's perfectly fine. But, what I need to see is like a weekly thing, or, make it clear what is part of the task and the process they need to go through. And I need to be sort of part of, at least partly.
I like that. That's great. All right. So, one thing that's come up a number of times during our conversation is privacy issues, and maybe some alternatives that professors might consider because of these privacy issues. So, what are some of the privacy things professors should consider when assigning social media to their students?
Well, first of all, we have to remember that these are public websites.
Hmm.
And, free use means that we are actually the products, as we all know. And, the all benefits that I mentioned before are actually counterbalanced by the potential harm this can do to students. And I mentioned it several times, so I won't go into detail, but I think we just have to remember, and actually remember for ourselves, but again, talk to the students openly about in the very beginning, um, even with a sort of almost didactic aim to teach them how to use these platforms, even in their personal life, because I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
students are not really aware of what is public and what is private and how they can control, at least to some extent, their privacy
Right.
settings. So even making them aware of that and saying, now we go to privacy settings and this and that. So actually very didactic discussion, but it's an important thing. Secondly, I actually, first, I would say, I would not advise making use of any social or open social media tool or platform obligatory. Because I don't think we can force students, and at least some universities definitely have policies on that, but in general, we cannot force students to use a platform they are uncomfortable using. So, if they, again, in the discussion that you have with them, this comes out, then obviously you will have to think of alternatives. One of them is the one I mentioned before. There is a way to recreate closed platforms, even Twitter-like platforms, where people use the same style and everything, but it's just in your class, so it doesn't go outside. Nobody reads them, so you can fulfill at least the some of the purposes in a more safe way. For blogging, obviously, you can make it password protected. So if I always give them the choice. So if they want to have it open, because some of them really want to use this idea of, I want to have people from outside comment, because this is opening my mind and my eyes to things that I was not aware before. But some people are really not comfortable with that. And I, again, give them the choice to have it password protected. And then obviously, if there is something collaborative that needs to be done, you can share the password with the peers that need to look,
Right.
comment, or with me, obviously, as a teacher. But making the public status by default, the default, I would definitely not encourage. So
Okay.
discussion first, and then explaining, if of course the public element is the important one, you cannot have a hidden Twitter and still want to talk to practitioners.
Right.
So if that is the point, then of course give them the choice maybe to make another account if they don't feel okay using their personal account. Again, what social media is doing is it's basically collapsing the contexts. So if you use a one social platform for your personal life, and all of a sudden the teacher asks you to use that platform for the course, you might not feel comfortable, and that's absolutely fine. So that's why the option to make a different account should be there, or even not to take part in the task if you're really uncomfortable. So again, no obligation. But I think out of all these things, the most important is trying to not to teach, to train students to be in control of how they use social media, of how they use the information about themselves that goes out, and how to control that to the extent that the platforms allow us to control it. But even
Hmm.
that, they should be aware of what is out there and out of their control. So those boundaries, I think, are very important, as important an objective in using social media as it's actually your normal course objective. Yeah, I think that's really important.
Yeah, I love everything that you said. And, the first thing that you mentioned was that on social media, as users, we are the products. Now, I think that that makes a lot of sense to you. It makes a lot of sense to me. But for a lot of people, they don't necessarily think about how their data, how their use of social media makes money for that particular company. And that's something that's really important when we're asking students to then sign over that data essentially to the company. So So that's why giving students an option to keep things private, to have a private account, or even to not participate on the platform is so important. One thing that I recommend to all of my clients, especially all the professors that I work with, is to actually read the terms of service of the social media platforms that you're going to be using. And if you're going to be using and asking your students to use a social media platform, that's something that you might want to do. It's important to see how our data is being used. It's important to see what kind of protections we have and what kind of control we can have over it. And so that's the other thing that I wanted to, kind of reiterate that you said, is that having a lesson on those privacy settings, on the privacy implications, is something that I think a lot of professors might not even consider, or maybe not even be aware of, that those are options for themselves. So including that as part of, the planning for this lesson is so important. So, considering those privacy implications in terms of the legal issues of what actually those servicers are doing, and also teaching students how to, have agency in those decisions. By changing their privacy settings. I thought that was so important. So I'm really glad that you brought those two things up.
If this is one thing they will take out of the course, then it is I'm very happy, because, but actually you were saying that a lot of professors would not think about that. And in fact, I think in the back of their minds, they do. And this is what actually prevents a lot of them of even trying to use social media.
Yes.
So this is a very tricky one, because I've been talking about the pros, of course, the cons as well. But I still think, as a sort of, as a summary, I still think that the pros can actually outweigh the cons if designed properly, if communicated properly, and if you really include this element you just mentioned of, training your digital information literacy skills, right. I call them, or knowledge management skills, or whatever. And I think this is key. Give it a try. I think if we talk about all these aspects now in the end, I think it again might leave the viewer with the idea that it's a tricky one, and it is a tricky one. I definitely cannot hide that. And I haven't really seen, I've seen a lot of professors hesitating a lot.
Yeah.
And I also have not been the one to push, because it does take quite a bit of design and desire to actually make it work, to have it really function well. Having a great concept. For instance, there was a person, I really have to remember this. There was a person, because it was one of the best examples I've heard yet. And this was in my PhD research 2 or 3 years ago. And there was a professor that was actually using Twitter in the UK. There was a professor that was using Twitter to actually connect his students with American policymakers. Ooh. So he was really doing it during the class, and literally, he had it a little bit planned. He had some preliminary discussions, I guess, with these people, and they would tweet live back and forth in the class during the class, and really amazing. It really had
so cool.
During the elections and everything. So for the students, it wasn't something to be exposed to that they would never have had, possibility to have otherwise.
Wow.
And it wasn't even it was more like a live following of what was going on, rather than having just someone talk to them in the classroom. It was literally, they could follow that person, and then of course they established a bit closer contact. So they even had the students they could even get more out of the respective people. I think that was great. It started a bit serendipitously. All these things start a little bit like that, but they had a concept and they said, okay, we're going to go on that, because this is something I cannot do in my classroom. So this is also something I've been following quite a bit in my PhD, trying to see how technology, and that was all before COVID, trying to see how technology was used to really enhance the learning experience, like even completely rethink the learning experience, and essentially do something that you couldn't do without. And this is really something you couldn't do without. You couldn't have your students exposed to what's going on in American elections live. Otherwise, you honestly couldn't do that. And then have the students interview those people and so on. So it all built on this Twitter contact. So if you find, and that's something that I think in the end, the message is try to think of your use of the tools. And we come back to that familiarity I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned. So the more you're familiar, the more you realize where it can help your students.
That's great.
And you design a task where they can use it to actually feel the benefits like you are feeling them. Otherwise, okay, it can support the learning, but there are instances where it can really redefine the learning. And if you find it in your in your mind and in your philosophy to actually get to those moments, do it. Do it with all those precautions we talked about, but give it a try.
Oh, I love that. Well, Alexandra, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I feel like we covered a lot of bases, and it will really help people who are considering using social media in their classes. So if you've been listening to this, I'm going to link to Alexandra's article down below this video, and that's going to give you all of the details and more ideas for how to use Twitter and everything. So be sure to check that out and hit your subscribe button so you can follow The Social Academic here on YouTube for our next live conversation. Alexandra, before we wrap up, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, thank you. I think I've added everything I wanted, and the last message was the most important. Give it a try, design it well. It can pay off. Thank you so much for your invitation.
Thank you so much for coming. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning into our live stream. Hit that like button and be sure to subscribe to The Social Academic today. All right. The live stream